Hi. Today's episode is going to be the Dark Ages. And when I say the Dark Ages, I mean the West European Dark Ages, or the period from around the fall of Rome until the rise of medieval Europe around 1000 AD. And this is the time period that most histories don't really know what to do with, where of history that we grew up with is it's called Whig history. And Whig history is that you see progress over time, and the history of humanity is the history of progress, where you go back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, and then they innovate, and then there's this weird period in between you don't know how to deal with, and then we jump to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and science, etc. Our narrative of history conceptualizes everything in terms of progress. And so if there's a period where progress doesn't happen, we don't really know what to do with it. And so our narrative of history is that there are certain periods where we just skip over, and the Dark Ages is one of that. And so if you read a textbook that you would read in school, basically the state enforced educational system, the way it normally works is that they talk about the Greeks and the Romans. They have one chapter on the Greeks and the Romans, and that's normally this very one-sided understanding of the Greeks and the Romans, where the Greeks, all humans are crazy monkeys. That's an important lesson. And so it leaves out that the Greeks and the Romans were crazy monkeys, and it forgets that, like, their religious side, their bloodthirstiness, the amount they thought about sex or did drugs. The Greeks and the Romans were not the rational people, not the rational scientific people. They were, but they were the opposite too. And so it has this very one-dimensional look at the Greeks and the Romans. Then you just skip over the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. And that's important, and I want to dig into that because I can understand skipping over the Dark Ages, but don't skip this video. I want to make that clear. Where the Dark Ages was holistically a period where European civilization went into decline, where cities were smaller, where England at least lost writing, where the ability to have the beautiful Roman baths and build the roads and the aqueducts, that just stopped. So it was a legitimate period of civilizational decline. So if you want to use the history of civilization as the history of the world, I can understand the incentive structure you're operating under to ignore the Dark Ages. But ignoring the Middle Ages is just insane. By the time we get to 1250, Europe had become the most advanced society up to that point in history, barring China at the same time. And so if you're skipping over medieval Europe, you're skipping over like a genuinely very advanced, very interesting society. And watch the video on the European High Middle Ages we have if you want to know more. And I think a lot of this is anti-religious bias, where the Middle Ages was both a very religious society and it was a very advanced one. And our current academia doesn't like religion because they derive their right to rule from the conscious human mind. And so if you have God and religion, then the power of the conscious human mind shrinks. Because if you're in a worldview where humans are the ultimate arbiters of reality, then the people who determine what the human social consensus is, being the academics, are incredibly powerful. So academia doesn't like religion due to that. And it's also why academia, I like to say, and this is my anthropology axe to grind, that modern anthropologists write all of humanity as if they're upper middle class educated people in a suburb of Boston. And I'm an Anglo from Pennsylvania, which is culturally very close to an educated person in Boston, but I feel like anthropology textbooks have no comprehension of the culture I grew up in, let alone India or China. And what I say to anthropology people is, if your model of the human condition can't explain India or China, you're just it's just a bad model, because most people in the world are Asian. So if you can't explain Asians, you don't understand humanity. And so that's what our theory of history is. It's basically, we skip over the Middle Ages, we skip over, and then we go to educated thinkers in the 16 and 1700s, and then the American Revolution. And this is also a pretty skewed understanding of history. And we do have a good comprehension of how messy like the American founding fathers were. But it's, in my opinion, it's pretty schizophrenic. And in that we hyper focus on the things we dislike, and we don't see them holistically as people who had to make hard decisions in hard times. And so with all of this, the Dark Ages get left out because our society doesn't really know what to do with the Dark Ages. And for most of recent Western history, the Dark Ages were written up as just this period of savagery when the Europeans dropped the ball. Because if you want to compare Europe on the global stage, under the Greeks and the Romans, the Europeans were competing for the most advanced society in the world. And then once you get to past 1300, Europe became the most successful society in the world. But during the European Dark Ages, although there was a global Eurasian Dark Age where China and Rome had civilizational collapses at the same time, around 200 AD. The thing, though, is that China and India and Islam recovered much faster from their Dark Ages than Europe did, where by the time we get to 600 AD, China had reformed under the Sui and the Tang dynasty, and India's Dark Age was a lot less severe, and Islam, the Middle East didn't really experience a Dark Age at all. It did a little bit, but like the Middle East was its most advanced under Islam at the same time when Europe was in the Dark Ages. So if you want to compare Europe to the world, the Dark Ages are like the least flattering place to compare European civilization to the rest of Asia, where a lot of Asia at this time period were having their golden age. In 800 AD, Islam and China were, comparatively to the rest of the world, the best off they ever were. The Tang dynasty was probably the most powerful dynasty in Chinese history. The Abbasids under Harun al-Rashid were probably the peak of when the Middle East was most advanced vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And so for most of Western history, most of recent Western modern history, from like 1600 until from the Enlightenment until like 15 years ago, the Dark Ages were remembered as this period of squalor and collapse. And recently there's been this whole academic school to rehabilitate the Dark Ages. And this is like, I call it revisionist history. Revisionist history is this 20th century mental model of the world where basically we want to do the exact opposite of what our ancestors did. And so revisionist history says that like our ancestors viewed tribal people as savages. We're going to view them as enlightened. Our ancestors loved the Greeks and the Romans. This is why the Greeks and the Romans are problematic. You know the story. And so 80% of revisionist history is wrong. About 20% is correct, in my opinion. And so the revisionist histories have tried to paint the Dark Ages as this like beautiful advanced time period where it was this European golden age. And I think that's as ridiculous as the just complete collapse of civilization model. And I'm going to say why over the course of this video, because I think this is true for a lot of historic time periods. For a lot of historic time periods, both opposing narratives are correct at the exact same time. And they fight each other, but the reality is they both have validity. Where, for example, nature versus nurture, it's the same thing. We've consistently found in studies that human nature is half genetic, half cultural. And so they're both true at the same time. And so let's get into, I've talked about how we see the Dark Ages, which is important because this is one of the eras where our biases are colored very strongly when we look on it. So I wanted to dispel the mental projections we shove onto the Dark Ages. And so what actually happened in the Dark Ages, where it's a gradual process. And this is something people fail to realize. They just think Rome was this glorious civilization that had cleanliness and science, and it was advanced. And then Rome was just crushed by barbarians. And the reality is that Rome gradually bled itself over the course of centuries. And over time, as after Rome lost all of its life force, it was eaten up by maggots. Rome was a body. The Germanic barbarians were maggots, and they ate up the Roman Empire. And then you saw this restart. And I don't like over relying on theories of history. One of my favorite quotes ever is from the Zen monk Dogon. Do not confuse the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. And what that means is don't over rely on your narrative of history, on whatever theory you use to explain the world. Look at the facts for what they are, have your theories, but don't let your theories completely control you. But I think Spengler has genuinely the best narrative about the Dark Ages, where Spengler has this theory that societies develop in a certain cultural area time. They grow as far as they can. Then you see the logical contradictions and the issues of that idea. Then it runs out of momentum, and then the civilization collapses. And if you want to read Spengler, don't. He's one of the worst authors I've read. Just read a summary. But Spengler's got a lot. He's one of the most interesting philosophers I've read. And what I'd say one of the biggest misconceptions about this era of history is that Rome died culturally centuries before it was conquered. Where if you look at the Roman Empire, classical civilization, which is the term people use for the Greeks and the Romans, they stopped developing new ideas around before the birth of Christ. Where if you look at Roman literature, the last great Roman literary piece that at least I know there are other authors, but the last big one was around the time of the 1st century AD or the 1st century BC. So, and same things set for technology, same things for economics, same things for culture. The Romans set into this cultural mold before the birth of Christ, and then Rome kept going for their 400 years before it fell apart. And Rome was not a creative society. This is one of the things that we get wrong, where we think the Romans were super advanced and scientific because they built really big buildings that we can still look at. But the Romans they invented almost nothing, and they were reliant on the Greeks. And so the Greeks made all this culture. The Romans conquered the Greeks. And then what happened is that once you had burned through all the logical outcomes of Greek culture. In the same way, like rock and roll, by the time you get to 1985, like every single variation in rock and roll you could do has been done. And then rap overtook rock and roll was the most popular genre. In the same way that the Christians and the Muslims overtook Greco-Roman civilization. And so it's like that just the life force had been pulled out of Rome. And if you want to know more, watch the video on the fall of Rome, where there is a whole evolution going on here, where Rome became this authoritarian socialist economy, which crushed Rome's economy. It crushed its birth rate. And for the last few centuries of the Roman Empire, you're looking at this hyper unequal socialist command economy theocracy, and the Romans hadn't, by the time they fell, the Romans hadn't invented anything in 400 years. So the theories you have that the Roman Empire was destroyed due to Christianity or due to foreign influence or there's 10 different theories for what killed the Roman Empire's energy. And it seems to have been a gradual thing that was just brought about by the Roman culture going through every possible cultural outcome. There was just a tired society. And you were running off fumes. And this is very much what the culture felt like at the time, where towns would build their walls smaller every year. A successful society, every year, every generation, the city's walls grow larger. In a dying society, every generation, the city's walls grow smaller. And for this whole time period, from, let's say, 200 AD until 1000 AD, the walls of cities grew smaller and then they fossilized. And I think that's a great place to start because history is fundamentally a process that's lived for people. We can look at the maps, we can look at the demographics, the statistics, but fundamentally, history is a series of choices that people have to make at that given moment in history. And so what had happened in the Roman Empire that encouraged people to flee to the countryside, because in the late Roman Empire, people would run away from the cities and move out to the middle of nowhere. And a lot of that was to escape repressive governments because Rome as a society had become incredibly autocratic and tyrannical. And so people would run away to as far away from the authorities as they possibly could. And they would try to find surrogate authorities where, as Rome became more corrupt and more predatory, the people stopped trusting the government authorities. And instead, people would move out to the countryside, and then wealthy people would become tribal chieftains. And so you would have wealthy people move out to the countryside, and then the peasants under them would follow their tribal chieftains instead of the government. And so over this time period, as the government became more and more corrupt, people vested their loyalty in local authorities because they were the people who were identifiable to them. And this, over the course of like 1,000 years, evolved into feudalism, where in medieval Europe, feudalism was this social structure where basically a private security company runs a town, and then in exchange for paying rents, they protect him. That wouldn't evolve until like 1000 AD, but the system in the late Roman Empire where people would move out to the countryside and have rich people protect them, that evolves due to the corruption of government. And with this, with the decline in population, the decline in trade, because taxes in the late Roman Empire were so high, you had no incentive to produce stuff. And so the economy became very rural, and it became very, people lost the use of coinage. And this is probably the best metric for when Europe was in the Dark Ages, when Europe used coinage. Because from the fall of Rome until like 1000 AD, Western Europe it barely had coinage. You had a couple like silver pieces that were used for large amounts of trade, but most Europeans lived self-sufficient lives where their villages supported them. And what that signifies is that we are a society where the scale of people's lives shrunk a lot. And in the late Roman Empire, you'll hear about wealthy Romans having estates in France, in North Africa, in Spain, and Italy, estates in 5 different European countries. Because once you've got the big empire, you can very easily collect properties around. But as the Roman Empire fell, you saw that people started operating under much smaller areas where you thought about your village and your county because that was the scale that could be protected. In the Roman Empire, all of this long travel, all this long distance stuff was protected by this mega state. But when you're governed by your chieftain, that makes your world a lot smaller. Do you have any questions so far?
No, I just keep it up.
Okay, sounds good. And the thing with the Dark Ages is that it's a world that appears very small to us. And that's the best way to say it. And I'm reading a fascinating book now that makes a claim about the Dark Ages that I don't know if it's actually true, but it's interesting at least. The book's called Coming to Our Senses by Maurice Berman. And the thesis of the book, and this is a really cool book. I don't agree with all of it, but it's definitely changed my worldview. And that's the kind of thing that I respect, where an author comes at me from a completely different perspective, and it makes me change my perspective. And he said that in the Dark Ages, Europeans lost the ability to have interior, introspective lives, where in Greece and Rome and in the medieval Europe and modern Europe, you have people who write about what they feel about things and what their internal monologue is and like what their inner experience is. And we don't have any records from the Dark Ages about people talking about their inner experience and their inner lives. And this is one of those things where I think we should study the field of consciousness more in order to have a good answer. Similarly with genetics, for sorts of fields that we haven't studied that deeply, I don't trust any results. But it is an interesting thesis. I would lean against it because I think that if you're in a non-literate tribal society, because the only people who could read and write in Dark Age Europe were the church, is that the world is conceptualized orally, and also we don't get any writing of later records of what people were doing. So I think people did have internal emotional states. It just wasn't written down. It was conceptualized through what you'd said to your cousin or your brother or people around you. But I think that's one of the fascinating things about history that needs to be studied more. Because there was this book that came out called The Bicameral Mind, where it's this thesis that around the time of the Bronze Age, people didn't know their inner monologues belonged to them, and so they attributed them to gods. And I don't know if that's true. I haven't studied the theory enough. But if you're in a society where people believe in magic and gods, as if they're just obvious, like in a lot of the third world today, in Africa or Southeast Asia, magic is just an obvious thing in people's lives. And so I think that should be something that we should study as a culture, why certain societies had such different experiences of consciousness, which leads me to the biggest variable of the Dark Ages, that being the church. Whereas the Roman Empire fell, spoilers, the thing that replaced it was the Catholic Church, where the Roman Empire, or the western half of the empire, was attacked by barbarians. And what happened, as I said before, is that the government became so corrupt that it lost the ability to do anything. And what happened instead was that the church filled the void, where if you look at the very most smart people in the Dark Ages, such as St. Augustine, Gregory of Tours, they were people who went into the church. And the church at this time allowed people to have wives. And so you could be a monk and also have a family and that stuff. And so the incentives were less against it. And that's because the normal government had become so corrupt. And if religion over history is one of those weird things where if your society is more religious, that probably means is you have a worse society. I find with these sorts of things, it's one of these strange catch-22s where your society gets worse, your people get more religious. As they get more religious, your society cooperates better. As people cooperate better, they get richer, then they get poorer because they're richer and they lose values, and then the cycle just restarts. It's one of those things.
Is it more correlation than causation?
Most things are chicken and egg, and this is one of the things that the modern people don't think about, but almost everything in the world is like an emergent phenomena. Or like, take you, Eric. Like, you are the composition of your parents, of your hometown, of your culture. Like, you are an emergent phenomena that has come out from your entire surroundings. And it's the same thing with countries. Like, you can't put a year to where France start. France is a mix of all these different cultures. That's just the way, like a hurricane gradually forms. And so I think it's partly causation, it's partly correlation, where it's this whole like cycle of civilizational rise and fall, which has to happen. And then religion is a factor in that, where like the religion civilizes people and it makes people better at cooperating. And then they do that, and then they don't need the religion anymore. And then the cycle continues. It's what the Bible talks about, where the Bible says that people follow God until they get wealthy enough they don't need to. Then they get pushed around. Then they start following God again. And the Dark Ages is indicative of that. The Dark Ages is it is historically a period that not that much happened in, but anthropologically and culturally, it's completely fascinating. And the reasoning for that is actually that having a Dark Age is one of the best things that can happen to a civilization. And the reason I say that is if you look at India and China, India and China had their own versions of the Dark Ages in which, for example, India stopped having coinage, it stopped having cities, it stopped having an advanced economy around 200 AD, and then Hinduism took over India, and the same like Christianity took over Europe. And in China, the Han Dynasty fell around 200 AD, and then they had a couple centuries of chaos. And they pulled things back together by 600. And so India and China both had dark ages, but they weren't dark ages that were big enough to rupture those civilizations. Where the India of today is the same society as the India of 2,000 years ago, as is also true in China, where if you look at China's religion, its legal code, its ethnicities, its economic system, these were all things that China's foundations before European colonialism had already been established by the time of the birth of Christ. So in India and China, they had dark ages, but the dark ages weren't big enough to rupture the old society. In the western half of Eurasia, though, the cultural changes implicit around the Dark Ages were huge enough that it just built entirely new civilizations. And so out of the old civilizations came the old Greek and the Romans and the Persian civilizations fell, and then out of it came Islam, Eastern Orthodox, and Western civilization. And so what happened in Dark Age Europe is that you saw the destruction of the old classical culture. And for example, one of the largest components of this was the breakup of the clan, where we've analyzed Italian documents from this time period. And what we've found is that around 600 was a cultural change where people were no longer addressed by their clan, but by themselves as individuals. So I would be Rudyard of the Lynch clan in the pre fall of Rome world, where you're like, Asians, like I would be, if I was Chinese, I'd be Lynch Rudyard. Asians put the family name first and then the given name. The reasoning for that is that in their society, the family always comes first. And so to try to put yourself as an individual before your family or your village is the height of arrogance in those kinds of collectivist societies. But then they submit to an autocratic leader who does get to do it. And most societies in history are collectivist, but around the time of the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church banned cousin marriage. And this is one of the biggest historic changes that no one's heard of, because the banning of cousin marriages means that these clans that existed forever could no longer exist. And I lived in Peru for a month, and I lived in a clan compound in Peru. And this is how almost all humans in history lived, where the clan compound was this gated community. There were about 6 or 7 houses, about 24 people family members, all descendant from the same grandpa, who lived in this gated community. And so they would work in each other's businesses. They would hang out together. They would, in those kinds of societies, your family is your entire life. Modern Peru is like, they don't have arranged marriage anymore, at least where I was. And there is more of like a market economy, but in most societies in history, your parents tell you who to marry. They tell you what work to do. You hang out with your cousins as hobbies. And what the Catholic Church did was break up the clan by banning cousin marriage. And so this created the Western individual. And individualism is probably the most important defining independent feature of Western civilization, where the one thing Western civilization has that no one else in history does is individualism. And there's this whole argument that comes from Joseph Heinrichs, the weirdest people in the world, about how individualism is what made the West so successful, with the ability to, because if you live with your family, imagine if your parents made all of your decisions for you. Neither of us would be in the Sun Belt. We'd be back in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Your parents tell you to get a boring job, marry a local girl. It's an incredibly conservative society. But when people make decisions out of their own self-interest, they take risks like, I'm going to move across the world. I'm going to become an adventurer. I'm going to start a gold mine in Afghanistan. And so that's why Europeans did those things and other societies didn't, or at least a big reason. And so I can't understate the importance of the Catholic Church and and creating the individual during the Dark Ages. And it's lots of choices like that, where most histories of I was looking before I got on the call about what books to recommend about this time period. And it's one of those weird ones where, like for the Rise of Rome video, there's lots of books on the history of Rome and very few on that specific sub period. Because when you get far enough back into history, books will cover like a 500,000 year period. And so a lot of books on the Dark Ages are books on the Middle Ages, because the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages get shoved together in most historiography. And but the most common title for these kinds of books is The Birth of Europe, because Europe is actually a Greek word, but the Europe that we know, the Western civilization that we know, stems from the Dark Ages. And this is a huge I guess it isn't a huge point of contention, but it's a relative one where I don't think the Greeks and the Romans were Western civilization, where the Greeks and the Romans were collectivist, they were aristocratic, they were pagan, they weren't capitalist, they didn't have science. So they had a different legal code, at least in the English-speaking world. And so they had different languages. And so all of those things are different between us and the Greeks and the Romans. And we cherry-pick the things that are similar between us and the Greeks and the Romans. Like the Greeks and the Romans had early versions of democracy or science, but our versions of democracy and science are different in very key ways from the Greeks and the Romans, where the Greeks and the Romans thought applying science to the real world or testing science was ungentlemanly. It was morally taboo. And our democracy comes from the Middle Ages and medieval parliaments. It doesn't come from Greece or Athens, or Athens and Rome. And so if you want to look at Europe in this time period, for example, all of Europe's languages developed in this time period. French, English, Spanish, Italian, they were all the European nationalities were formed in this era as well, where the normally from Germanic tribes. The French were the Frankish tribe, the English were the Angles, the English tribe, the Spanish were the Visigoths, the Italians were the Lombardy, like northern Italy. That was the Lombard tribe. So it was these Germanic tribes going into Europe and then forming the countries that are modern Europe. And so lots of things in the European character formed in the Dark Ages, and then in the Middle Ages, they were crystallized into institutions. Where, for example, with parliaments and democracies, the Germanic tribes had institutions called all things, where for all the Germanic tribes behind the frontier, because the fall of Rome, this is probably a good video to watch with the Fall of Rome video, because I'm hopscotching between them. Where, for example, I've talked very little about the actual Fall of Rome and the Germanic tribes ripping it up. But the Fall of Rome happened with the Romans in France and Italy and Spain behind the Rhine and the Danube. And then beyond that was the forests and the German tribes who lived without cities or towns or that sort of thing. And over time, the Romans had civilized the Germanic tribes, and because the Germans had served as merchants or soldiers or even accountants in the Roman Empire. And so the technological gap had been largely bridged by the time and the Romans had also been into decline. So the gap had been kind of bridged by the time you get to the fall of Rome. And so the German, and the larger your society scales, the harder it is to have democracy. I think it's a fair criticism that it's very, very difficult to have a multi-ethnic, continental-sized democracy. Your friend Kurt Yarvin would tell that to you, though. And the thing with the Romans is that once their scale expanded, they moved from democracy to empire. And for the Germans, when they were these small warrior kingdoms, they were democracies. And so what would happen is that there were a couple noble families that were respected, and like an enterprising young guy could rise up through the ranks and then become one of the new nobility, normally by marriage. But let's say in this tribe, you have 4 noble families, and then every generation you elect one of their members to be the tribal king. And he goes on war, he kills people, he gets gold, he gives it to his buddies. And so the system is whichever leader can go to war, then kill enough people, bring back gold to his buddies, and then they are happy. And you can tell why this is a warrior society, where their top god is the god of war and the god of strategy, where the Norse, around the birth of Christ, the Norse moved from the Germans moved from their top god being about forests and fertility and that stuff, to their top god being the god Wodan or Odin, of strategy, war, mysticism, planning, men, because the government were warriors. And you can also see why the society had this virility where they could conquer Rome. And so an example of the sorts of cultural things that happened in the Dark Ages is that this Germanic all thing, it was formed in the Dark Ages, and then in the Middle Ages, it became this structured institution, that being the parliaments of Europe. And almost all of medieval Europe had a parliament. Almost every country in medieval Europe. Or the pirates of the Dark Ages became capitalism, where the startup structure comes from a pirate crew, where everyone gets liquidity in the everyone gets like a shared stock in the pirate ship, and then you and your crew man it together. And so that's a lot of what was happening. And so over time, what happens is that you see the formation of this new Western civilization that's a combination of the German tribes, the Christians, and the Romans. And I don't think it was all clear that these groups would mix together and form a new society, and especially so one that became the most successful civilization in history, where if you asked the Greeks, the Byzantines, or the Arabs, they would say the West European Franks, which is what they called them, because the most populous group were the Franks, who we'll talk about later. They thought they were just savages. The Muslims said the West Europeans were the same as wild animals. And so Western civilization formed as this synthesis of Roman culture, Christian culture. And these two became fused because after the Germans conquered Western Europe, the old Roman nobilities went into the priesthood, where that was their general vector to control society, because they had lost the will to fight. And thus, the way they held on to power was through religion. And so Bertrand Russell and Will Durant, two authors who are incredible, they described medieval Europe as the battle between this literary Latin church south and the North Germanic barbarian warriors. And most medieval philosophy were the Latin Southern church people trying to rationalize why using the church to get more power over the barbarians was the good thing to do. And in places like France, these two groups mixed together, and the gradient of cultural change due to the barbarian invasions varied a lot over Western Europe. Where in England, for example, England's furthest north of the Roman possessions, it was complete cultural replacement, where just half of the population in England, the genetics showed that they just killed off all the men and married the women, the German invaders to England. In France, the northern part of France, it was a combination of Germanic migration with local population surviving. In the German Rhineland, it was just German replacement. And in Italy and Spain, in the south of France, it was small pockets of Germans who were assimilated into the local Latin population. And so you see that this division between Germanic Europe and Latin Europe became the formation for the new Western civilization. The alliance between the church and the German warriors is interesting because in most cases, the German invaders were a different ethnicity from the German invaders were they were a different sect of Christianity than the locals. And keep in mind, this was the era that was filled with intractable religious disputes, where Christians would kill each other over like details in the Bible. And so these tiny sects of Christianity were constantly killing each other. And the German invaders in Italy and Spain were Arians. The Visigoths were the rulers of Spain. And then first of all, the Odoacer, who was part of this tiny tribe called the Hayrules, they owned Italy. The Hayrules couldn't control Italy. Then the Ostrogoths invaded Italy. Then the Byzantines conquered Italy. Then the Lombards invaded Italy. Italy was a hot mess. We should probably talk about that. But so Italy, Spain were ruled by Arian Christians, and the local population, I hate saying this term because it's kind of anachronistic, they were Catholics. The native population of West Europe were Catholics. And I don't like saying that because the Catholicism, it was just the church. And the term Catholic developed over centuries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We get the point. But the Aryans, so the places where the German ruling class were Aryans, they were places where the nobility couldn't work with the locals because they were different sects of Christianity. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these were the places where the Germans were a tiny ruling minority. And I just thought of this, but it would make sense if the Germans opted for Arianism around in North Africa, Italy, Spain, where they were massively outnumbered because they needed to have a unifying religion to pull themselves together to oppress the lower classes. But the problem, though, was you had these tiny elites that as they grew more decadent, because when they stopped being these barbarians, they became wealthier, is that they grew weak. And so this is why there's another interesting factor here that they were more lightly populated nomadic peoples from Eastern Europe. The Vandals, the Visigoths, whatever, they were pseudo-nomadic. And so they were lightly populated anyway. And so they were wiped up pretty quickly. And you guys should watch the Byzantine episode. But the East Roman Empire went in this phase under Justinian of reconquering the Mediterranean. And I think it probably could have worked. And if it did, it would be comparable to China reunifying at the same time period. And what happened is that it caused a series of horrifying wars that destroyed Italy. And what we found recently in research is that the fall of Rome itself was not that bad for the economy of the Mediterranean itself. In northern France and in England, the fall of Rome totally killed the economy. And I don't want to overstate this. The economy still did go into decline, but in Italy, Spain, North Africa, there were still cities and trade after the fall of Rome. What really killed Italy was the Byzantine invasions. And the Byzantine invasions wiped out every major city in Italy, and it just genocided, I would guess, over half the population. There was also a plague that killed half the population, so my guess would be that Italy's population collapsed by 2/3 over the 6th century. And so that the wars of Justinian were really the thing that killed the economy of Mediterranean Europe. And then afterwards, the Muslims rolled up over North Africa and into Spain. And the Byzantines were able to wipe out the Germanic Vandal kingdom in North Africa very quickly. And the Arabs were able to conquer Spain incredibly quickly. It was a small band of guys who were able to knock out the Spanish government in a single battle. Because as I said before, it was these small Germanic ruling classes that were on top of this basically destitute local population that had given up. And so they were very unstable. And so although those kingdoms were pretty based, and like I should have spoken about this, but for example, Theodoric's Italy was considered this enlightened despotism, where under Theodoric it was this flowering of poetry and philosophy and art, which is something we forget about. And I think most of the stuff was not that original in of itself, but it's nice to have some art in a dark age. Boethius is the only the important philosophers of this time period. Boethius was Italian. St. Augustine was North African. That maps with the Mediterranean thing I said. So in the Vandals also, the Vandals sponsored art and culture and poetry and philosophy and stuff. The Dark Ages are a gradient, like it gradually takes time, and the lowest point of the Dark Ages is probably like 700 AD. And it's this gradual decline. And one of the things that made the decline worse was the rise of the Muslims. And again, watch the Muslims video. Where the Muslims took over the Mediterranean, and the Muslims pushed the Europeans north, and it was one of the better things that, again, having your ass whipped is one of the better things that can happen to you as a country, because if your country gets beat up really badly, it can force your people to have it can force your people to go through a phase of self-reflection and self-improvement. And I think that's what determines an effective nation versus an ineffective nation. An effective nation faces suffering and uses it to improve. An ineffective nation faces suffering and does nothing. And so after being pushed back by the Muslims, and having fought the Greeks in Italy for decades upon decades of horrifying warfare, the Europeans started to form their own culture, and the big kingdom that survived from the barbarian wars were the Franks. And the Franks, again, France, it's the modern French. And the Franks were this tribal group from the modern Netherlands and Germany who conquered the north of France. And the north of France was strangely one of the last areas to there was a Roman commander called Syagrius who held the north of France as a military dictatorship until the very end of the fall of Rome. And the Franks, they did very well, partly due to... So the Merovingians were complete degenerates. That was the first ruling family. And then after that, the dictators, the military dictators under the Merovingians, the Carolingians, they were one of the best ruling families in European history. And the Franks did very well because they were the only Germanic barbarian group who were Catholics. And the local population were Catholics. And this created this degree of cultural unity across the whole population that meant that the French had a harder edge than a lot of the other peoples. And also, I think they were just there was more Germans and they were closer to Germany, so they could keep more of their culture and more of their men. And over time, under the military dictatorship that the Franks had, they conquered most of Western Europe. And so the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe in Spain, they controlled the south of France. At the start of the 6th century, the Franks drove the Visigoths out of the south of France. And then the Muslims attacked halfway up France, where Charles the Hammer, the military dictator of France, he was able to beat the Arabs at the Battle of Tours. And this is considered to be this big historic moment of what if the Arabs had been able to conquer France, because that would have changed history a lot. There's this whole debate between historians about could the Arabs have held on to France, and I think they probably could have held on to the southern half with a more Mediterranean climate. But once you get far enough, I think it's just too far from Spain for them to control. And I hate... With my alternate history background, I hate the nothing ever happened school of history. Tangent. I was listening to this alternate history podcast in high school that said America could have never conquered Canada in the War of 1812. And I'm thinking, we have 10 times their population. America totally could have done that. But it's the nothing ever happened school of history. And so under a couple of kings like Pepin the Short, and then Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is Old French, or Carlo Magnus for Charles the Great. And they expanded the Frankish Empire. They conquered modern Germany, and Charlemagne fought this huge battle against the Saxons. And a lot of people know the inhabitants of modern England as the Anglo-Saxons. And the Anglo-Saxons are from the north of Germany. So their cousins in North Germany called the Saxons. They worship the pagan gods, and they put up a generation-long battle against the Franks, where the Franks had to resort to genociding them to wipe it out. But they didn't genocide all of them. And the Saxons became a new generation of leadership in the new German Empire. And Charlemagne also fought and invaded into Italy, because his base of power was France, the Low Countries, and Germany. And he fought the Lombard kingdom in North Italy. The Franks conquered the Lombards. And then he installed the Pope in command of central Italy, where the Pope was just this completely corrupt institution. the Pope went through good periods and bad periods. And there was a bad period where the Pope literally had to avoid getting killed by thugs. And so there was this period that was around 200 years in the Dark Ages where it's just stuff that sounds like a joke happened. And it's just the Pope, this was the period when the Pope was basically it was like a B movie where no one was trying, where it was these competing sub factions of Italian noblemen who would fight over the papacy, and then no one listens to what the Pope said outside of Rome. And then there was a Pope. There's some crazy stories going on here. You should read the book "The Birth of the West" by Collins, where they had a stuffed mummified corpse of a Pope who was the Pope for like a period where they literally had a mummified corpse as Pope for a significant amount of time. And the Pope would have harems and assassinate people. It was not a good period. This was just not a good time. But there was a period where the Charlemagne gave the Pope this strand of central Italy. And so there was this weird thing where Charlemagne established Western Europe to be the new Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. And it wasn't really that Roman. It was Germanic tribes LARPing as the Romans. The whole of European history since could very effectively be seen as people LARPing as the Romans. And there was this weird political machination going on here where the Pope crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor after Charlemagne had liberated the Pope from thugs. And what happened there with the political machinations is the Charlemagne had to take the title, but the deal implicit into that was that the Pope could determine who the emperor was, because the Pope crowned the emperor. This was politically controversial, and this became probably the most important political issue in the High Middle Ages, as the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope fought over the legality of that moment of, did the emperor crown the Pope or did the Pope crown the emperor? And you guys should watch the High Middle Ages video. That goes into it more. The Dark Ages are one of those weird hinge moments in history where I've referenced like 5 other videos. Because it's one of those like turning points, but where you go from one set of history to another set of history. And Franks also pushed into the north of Spain, conquering the northeast of Spain. The biggest French historic epic was written in this time period. And this was also the era when the great European epics were about, where King Arthur, the Charlemagne cycles, Roland, Siegfried, they're all of the great European heroic stories are set in this time period because it was the West's heroic age, and all fantasy novels are set in this time period because it's this the records are so poor that you can insert whatever heroic story you want. And because the records don't contradict it, you can have plausible deniability. But there's this great European mythical story about Roland, who is this French commander who fought off attacks by the Arabs. It was really the Basques, and the Basques are the indigenous inhabitants of Spain who have this tiny area of the north of Spain. They've been doing their own thing for all of history. They're genetically distinct from the rest of Europe. And the north of Spain was all these tiny Christian kingdoms in poverty that would later reconquer the rest of Spain from the Muslims. And so if we're looking at Europe in the year 808, Western Europe in the year 800 AD under Charlemagne, this is the summary I have. So the Muslims control the Mediterranean, Spain, Sicily, South Italy, the islands, the sea. Western civilization has been pushed back into Italy, Germany, France, the Low Countries. The Anglo-Saxon tribes of England had been converted back to Christianity, and they had established kingdoms that over time had unified due to wars with the Vikings. And the British Isles had also converted to Christianity, where Ireland was Europe's biggest center of learning, where because Ireland wasn't part of the Roman Empire, it didn't have to deal with the cultural side effects of the fall of Rome. And so the most advanced scholars and philosophers were Irish. And so even in France or Germany, they would import the Irish to run the monasteries, to do education, and all that sort of thing. And that was largely wiped out by the Vikings, where the Vikings destroyed Ireland's advanced society. And Ireland was still this like pre-civilizational warring barbarian tribe peoples. So even though the Irish were very philosophically and intellectually advanced, they weren't advanced. They weren't advanced politically or socially. And Western Europe had this brief period called the Carolingian Renaissance, where Charlemagne had established this unified Western Europe, and then then it created this period of peace where Western Europe became quite wealthy. And this was a brief golden age where learning became more popular, cities started to develop, and Western Europe became this very you started to see the formations of what became later medieval civilization. And the current French and German and Italian identities stem from the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne. And the problem, though, was the Frankish Empire wasn't unified enough, and thus there was this lack of sense of grounding. And thus, when they stopped having hyper-capable leaders after Charlemagne, the empire split up into Eastern and Western halves, where the Germans became their own empire that also controlled Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and then France became a failed state, where France collapsed up into a dozen different sub-kingdoms. In Europe at this point in the 900s, it hit its second dark age, because there was the Carolingian Golden Age, the first dark age, and the second dark age. And in the second dark age, Europe was significantly wealthier and more advanced now than it was in the early Dark Age. There had been progress. Is that Europe was attacked on three axes by the Hungarians from the east, who raided out into France, Italy, Germany. The Hungarians were a complete menace, and they were enabled by Charlemagne wiping out the powerful nomadic Avar Confederacy in Hungary. And they had this incredible series of forts called the Ring. And then so Charlemagne broke the Ring, took their gold. And then the Magyars, or the Hungarians, came out of Central Asia originally, Siberia, then through Ukraine, and then they were a scourge on Europe. And they were finally defeated by the Saxons, leading the Germans, at the Battle of Lechfeld. And then so fighting off the Hungarians is what unified the Germans, and then the Hungarians converted to Christianity. The Vikings attacked across Europe. Watch the Viking video for more. The Vikings attacked England. They attacked France. They attacked north of Spain, Russia. And the Vikings built up an early capitalism, but they still devastated a lot of Europe. But through the process of that, modern England, France, and Scotland all developed to fight off the Vikings. And finally, the Arabs were raiding into France and Italy and Spain. And the Arabs had this port at Aix-des-Morgues in the south of France, where they would raid across France. And the Spanish nation and the Sicilian Norman nation formed against the Arabs. And so in this second, at the end of the Dark Ages, what we're seeing is the formation of this new, stronger Europe that developed through the ability to fight off this new wave of barbarian invaders. And so in 1000 AD, Europe, although it from the outside was a weak and primitive society, it had built up this inner cultural strength, and over the centuries had established these institutions so it could see the precipitous skyrocketing over the High Middle Ages. And Europe also around 1000 AD, it invented new plows and new technologies, which allowed its population to grow incredibly rapidly. And the Crusades later on also introduced new technologies, which pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages. That's my history of the European Dark Ages.
That's a great overview. We're a bit over time, so should we just wrap with the book recommendations?
Right. So I have not read this, but this is apparently the best history of this topic. Inheritance of Rome by Chris Wickham. World of Late Antiquity by Peter Brown. This is very good. Everything by Tom Holland is very good. The Forge of Christendom. Peter Collins's book, The Rise of the West, is also great. Empires and Barbarians by Peter Heather. This talks about the various barbarian tribes and that stuff. Next week is the American Revolution.
Oh, amazing. That'll be yeah, we've done a bunch of episodes on America, so that'll be a great one. People always appreciate
Yeah,
it.
I
Um,
know I've been holding back on modernity. You can't do this many episodes before. I have a rule that whenever you write a history, half of the history should be before 1000 AD and half should be after 1000 AD. So I've actually been following that rule for the episodes. So we've now moved the balance enough before 1000 AD that we can have more episodes in modernity.
and
Um,
why that time period as the
that's just from all the histories of the world I've read. That's the generally satisfying balance I find. If they're too ancient or too modern heavy, I get kind of annoyed, and I consistently find that like that's the right balance. And I think it's because like the problem with a lot of history writing is that you end up where like in the ancient world the only place that we have records of note is like Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and then you get to now where you have 7 continents in play. So how do you write like 3,000 years in the Middle East versus 100 years on 7 continents? And so that's the real. There's a couple other balances, like do you prioritize for talking about the rise and fall of civilizations or explaining the world? How you choose to write history determines a lot about who you are as a person.
Totally. Well, on that note, let's wrap here, Rudyard, and can't wait till next time for the American Revolution.
Of course, peace. It was great.